morning. It's really good to see everybody here together. Shana Tova. On January 20th this year, like many of you, I had my eyes glued to the television watching the inauguration. I saw the Obamas enter the stage and surprised myself by bursting into tears. I found myself lying on the floor in front of the TV, sobbing and shaking, almost in a state of shock. Later, I tried to process my reaction with my husband. When the Obamas walked in, it felt like the grown-ups were finally entering the room to take control after all this time of gaslighting and chaos. And the relief was almost too much. For me, having grown up in an environment with a violent, unpredictable father and no acknowledgement that anything was wrong, those feelings hit me especially hard. It was hard to take in the idea of light after so much darkness, of safety after so much trauma. When Rabbi Tzemach asked me to speak on the topic of rebuilding from a mental health perspective, I was honored and a little bit daunted. In truth, I felt a little bit like an imposter. Well, I've been a mental health professional for the past 20 years. Over the last year, and even more over the last several months, I have had times when I feel like I am barely holding it together. While I'm still able to do my job each day, helping my clients, I sometimes quietly harbor doubt as to what the heck I'm doing. Who am I to help others and to speak on this topic if I can't even manage myself? I am someone with a mental health history serious enough that it almost cost me my life. While it was decades ago, the stigma and shame surrounding issues of mental health and illness keep me from disclosing it. At times, when I start to feel pretty bad or even just feel the sadness or anxiety that everyone has been going through lately, I tend to push it down because I don't even want to admit those feelings to myself. Do we question the orthopedist with a broken leg? Or the oncologist with a history of lymphoma? And yet, somehow I have this belief that as a therapist, it's not okay to hurt or to have any sort of issues. Somehow I have to be the Dalai Lama and Susie Sunshine combined. But the past several years, and the past year and a half in particular, have led so many to struggle in so many ways. I'm no more special or protected than anyone else. So, I'm here today to talk about the importance of acknowledging and validating emotional struggles, big and small, no matter how embarrassing or shameful it may feel to do so. I think we can all acknowledge that our society has gone through a collective trauma, or I should say traumas, plural, in the last 5 years, and the last 18 months in particular. It started out in 2016 with the gaslighting of the last administration and the hatred and violence that were stoked by that administration, culminating in the shocking January 6th insurrection on the Capitol building. Then, there were the devastating ordeals of the last 18 months of the pandemic. The illness, death, loss of jobs and schooling, isolation, horrors experienced by frontline workers, the violent deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the more recent spate of violence against Asian Americans. I could go on, but I don't need to. I know I'm leaving a lot out, and I apologize for any oversights. When I used the word trauma to describe the effects of the above experiences on our society, I don't think many of you batted an eye. And what about individual experiences? Some, perhaps many, in our community have had direct, unspeakable losses and suffering related to these and other events. we are able to call these traumas without much question. These are what we call big T traumas, the ones we think about when we use that word. War, abuse, natural disasters, catastrophic accidents, the big stuff. Others of us were fortunate enough not to lose anyone close to us, to get sick, to be a direct caregiver in the trenches. And yet many are struggling. Many are hurting. Think about the last year and a half. Quarantine, loss of school and jobs, managing homeschooling and relationships and working from home, political turmoil, violence against marginalized communities, financial stress, much of which happened in isolation and without a sense of trust and leadership. These can be what we call little t traumas. The little t traumas are not as obvious, but still affect us and can build up over time. I know a 15-year-old high school freshman, the only extrovert in her family, who had always been a happy kid and done well in school. Moving to a new school where she didn't set foot for most of the year, dealing with distance learning, isolation from all of her friends, she fell into a depression. And this A student wound up with C's and D's for the first time in her life. But I didn't lose anyone, she said. I shouldn't feel this way. My client, who worked as an essential worker in a grocery store during the pandemic, suddenly felt paralyzed and unable to go on once things started opening up. But I'm not supposed to feel this way. It's a good thing that we're reopening. Another client had finally gotten her son, who is on the spectrum, into the right kindergarten in 2019. Then 2020 came along, and he was sent home for distance learning that was all but impossible given his needs. My client was stuck at home, trying to manage teaching him, caring for his toddler sister, and working part-time. Soon, her sleep became disrupted. She and her husband started arguing, and she started experiencing excruciating headaches. But we're safe. Everyone else is dealing with the same thing. It's not a big deal. I should be grateful that we're okay. According to trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk, trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people. So it's not about what happened, but how it affects you, and it's carried in the body. My husband, Max, found himself going to pick up food from a local restaurant during quarantine. While he stood outside waiting, another customer, also fully masked, kept standing closer than 6 feet. And my calm, peaceful husband found himself getting so rageful, he was ready to throw a punch. We didn't lose anyone close to us, thank goodness, didn't get sick. But how many of us have experienced some version of this reaction? Anxiety, hypervigilance of people getting too close, of people not following the rules during and after lockdown and all it entailed. These reactions are what van der Kolk talks about when he talks about the imprint on the body. Emotions are full body responses. Too many of these small t reactions to small t traumas over time can lead to significant symptoms. How many of you may be finding yourselves sleeping too much or too little, yelling at your kids unnecessarily? Maybe you're having migraines, unexplained body aches. Maybe you get that brief tightness in your chest or hold your breath when you step onto a crowded subway car. Or you find yourself sobbing at a movie that didn't affect you a few years ago. Some people find themselves compulsively cleaning. Funny thing to find yourself doing in the middle of a viral pandemic. Some people who go through big T traumas don't wind up with post-traumatic symptoms, and some who go through little t traumas do. So why is that? Part of it relates to certain underlying vulnerabilities, whether by history or biology. For me, my outsized reactions on Inauguration Day were triggered by dynamics from my childhood home that I had thought that I had fully worked through. For many of my therapy clients, various aspects of the past few years have awakened old wounds and symptoms of depression, anxiety, and more that had been in remission for years. Another part has to do with how the trauma is dealt with at the time. One of the most important factors, and one we have some control over, is acknowledgement of what has happened. But there's no way to acknowledge if you're telling yourself you shouldn't feel this way. For me, the denial of my own response comes both from the, but nothing terrible happened to me, as well as the internalized stigma about mental health. Now, to be clear, this is solely about me. In my work and my life, I am a fierce advocate in the fight against stigma around mental illness. But like for so many, it's much harder to apply this to myself. But anyway. Brushing little t traumas under the rug leads to symptoms. By validating the experience and acknowledging the reactions, we can decrease symptoms and lessen their impact. But what does acknowledging look like? Sometimes it's enough to simply acknowledge to ourselves, okay, I'm feeling sad and it's okay. Letting ourselves feel without judgment can sometimes be enough. For my husband, hi, he was able to notice his reaction at the restaurant and luckily keep himself from punching the guy. He realized that his rage was bigger than the situation warranted and also where it was really coming from. In addition to acknowledging to ourselves, we can talk about it with each other. When Max came home, he shared his experience with the family. This prompted many conversations as time went on about our reactions to people in our space. We were all really anxious about this. And moving into reopening was scary, so talking about it normalized our reactions and gave us more control over how we would respond in the future. My daughter went back to in-person school in the beginning of May. She hadn't been on the subway for over a year. Having already normalized the anxiety, we came up with a plan and took practice runs at off hours when the trains were less crowded to ease back into the process. As a result, when the time came to take the subway to school on her own during rush hour, she was ready and able to do so. Talking about our feelings and reactions can also mean actively reaching out and telling people when we're struggling. Now, I am the first one to admit that telling a friend or loved one, I'm having a hard time, or I need help, can be a scary thing to do. I began writing this during the Olympics, when suddenly mental health made the front page. This followed lockdown, when articles about mental health issues and therapy popped up every day. The conversation is gradually changing, making mental health easier to talk about, but the shame and stigma do still exist. I had to think long and hard about what to share in this speech. As a therapist, admitting to any sort of struggle still feels anathema, and I still won't go into details. But I do need to admit that rather than being a therapist robot, I am a person like everybody else. Well, maybe a little shorter than everybody else, but otherwise the same. I have feelings like everybody else. And while professionally I know better, when my friends and loved ones ask me how I'm doing, like many everybody else's, I am likely to respond, I'm fine, even when I'm not. So how do we change the dialogue? Of course, I'm not suggesting that we go into our mental health status with everyone we meet on the street, grocery store, or restaurant. Hi, I'm Jerry. I'll be your server today. How are you? Well, Jerry, I'm feeling kind of depressed. My sleep is an absolute mess, and I've been drinking like nobody's business. No, that would just be really bad boundaries. Obviously, we need to pick and choose whom we can trust and share with. But we do need to talk to someone. That can be a friend, a relative, a therapist. It can even be a hotline. Stay tuned for that. And what about when you are the someone? When a friend comes to you, It's totally human to try and fix it, to tell them not to feel bad, to deflect. But if you can, just listen. Give them space to feel what they're feeling. Try not to offer advice, platitudes, or solutions. In fact, if you're not sure, it's a great idea to say, "What do you need from me right now?" And if you have a close friend who is thick-headed like me and insists they're fine and you can see they're not, you can gently challenge them. "Are you really fine? You don't seem like yourself. Is something going on?" And if it gets to the point where you're concerned for the person's safety, don't be afraid to get help. There are resources. New York City has a dedicated 24-hour mental health hotline to call and text. We have, or will, not sure yet, listed these and other mental health hotlines and resources on TCC's website. And there's always 911. Even if you're saying to yourself, "I didn't lose someone. Others had it worse. It didn't directly affect me." You are a part of this society. You have been affected. It's okay to not be okay. So, rebuilding. The degree of impacts of the traumas of the past few years on our country are as yet unknown, and rebuilding will be a long, hard slog. But in the coming months, as individuals and in our communities, we can get started by acknowledging and validating whatever painful feelings arise, and by checking in with and talking and listening to each other. This will help us to process our anxiety, grief, fear, powerlessness, rage, and sadness, and to do so without losing hope. In that way, we can truly grow, rather than just try to patch over broken ground. I'll start. Hi. I'm having a bit of a hard time right now, and I guess that's okay.